Leapt Castle, the most haunted castle in Ireland. Chapter 1. The Stones Remember. In the heart of Ireland's county Offaly, where the rolling green hills meet the ancient slopes of the Slieve Bloom Mountains, there stands a castle that has witnessed more darkness than perhaps any other structure in the Emerald Isle. This is Leapt Castle, and its stones hold memories of nearly 800 years of bloodshed, betrayal, and restless spirits that refuse to fade into history's shadows. The castle sits approximately 6 kilometers north of the heritage town of Rescrea, accessible by the winding R421 road. From a distance, it appears much like any other Irish fortress, gray stone walls rising against the ever-changing sky, windows that once blazed with firelight now dark and watching. But those who know its history understand that Leapt Castle is different. It has earned its reputation as the most haunted castle in Ireland, and some say in all of Europe. The land itself remembers times before the castle, before even the medieval kingdoms that carved Ireland into warring territories. Archaeological evidence suggests that this site has been occupied since the Iron Age, around 500 BCE, and possibly even during Neolithic times. The ancient peoples who first settled here built ceremonial structures on this very ground, perhaps recognizing something in the land itself, some quality that made it sacred or significant. Some believe the site sits at the crossing of 2 ley lines, those mysterious alignments of ancient monuments that some claim channel spiritual energy through the earth. When the O'Bannon clan decided to build their fortress here around the year 1250, they were constructing upon layers of history already thousands of years deep. The O'Bannons were secondary chieftains in this region, powerful in their own right, but sworn in service to the even more formidable O'Carroll clan. The O'Bannons needed a stronghold to protect the fertile lands that bore their name, and to guard the strategic pass through the Slieve Bloom Mountains. But the castle's very name is born from blood and competition. Legend tells of 2 O'Bannon brothers locked in a bitter dispute over who would lead the clan and oversee the construction of the new castle. In those times, such disputes were not settled by words or votes. The brothers devised a test of courage and fate. They would both leap from a rocky outcrop on the site where the castle was to be built. The one who survived the fall would claim leadership and the right to build the fortress. We don't know which brother survived that fateful leap. History has forgotten his name, as it has forgotten so many names in this blood-soaked place. But one brother fell to his death on the rocks below, and the other walked away to build his castle. From that moment, the place was known as Leim Uí Banning, the leap of the O'Bannons. The very foundation of the castle was consecrated in blood, a brother's blood spilled for power and pride. Perhaps this original violence set a pattern that would echo through the centuries to follow. Or perhaps the land itself, ancient and sacred, demanded such sacrifices. The castle rose from the earth stone by stone, its walls thick and formidable, designed to withstand sieges and attacks from rival clans. The main keep, central tower that still stands today became one of the most well-fortified positions in all of Ireland. But the O'Bannons would not hold their castle for long. The O'Carroll clan, whose shadow already lay across the O'Bannons' territory, eventually took possession of Leapt Castle, most likely through marriage, the common way in those times for one powerful family to absorb another. By the early 1500s, Leapt Castle had become the principal seat of the O'Carroll chieftains, and it was under their rule that the castle would earn its reputation for horror. The O'Carrolls were known throughout Ireland as a fierce and brutal people. They stopped at nothing to achieve domination over their rivals and maintained their power through fear and violence. The castle they inherited had been built strong, and they made it stronger still, adding chambers and defenses, secret passages, and hidden rooms. Among these additions was a small chapel built into the upper levels of the keep, a place where the family could worship and hold private masses. That chapel would soon become known by a different name, the Bloody Chapel. As night falls over County Offaly and the stars begin to emerge above the Irish countryside, the silhouette of Leapt Castle stands dark against the sky. Inside its ancient walls, the stones remember everything. They remember the brother who fell, the blood on the rocks below. They remember the prayers spoken in the chapel, and the prayers that were cut short by violence. They remember the screams that echoed through corridors, the final gasps of those who died within these walls, betrayed by those they trusted. The wind moves through the empty window frames, carrying with it the whisper of old sorrows. And if you listen carefully, standing in the shadow of Leapt Castle as darkness gathers, you might hear something else on the wind, something that sounds like footsteps on ancient stairs, like the rustle of robes in a chapel, like the faint cry of those who died here and have never truly left. This is where our story truly begins. Not with the building of the castle, but with what came after, with the generations of violence that soaked into these stones, with the spirits that even death could not release, and with the terrible secrets that lay hidden for centuries, waiting to be discovered. Welcome to Leapt Castle. Welcome to the most haunted place in Ireland. Chapter 2. Rivers of Blood, the O'Carroll Years. The year 1532 marked a turning point in the dark history of Leapt Castle. Though the O'Carroll clan had already written many bloody chapters in the castle's story, under their control, Leap had become more than just a fortress. It had become a symbol of their ruthless determination to hold power at any cost. The O'Carrolls ruled their territory with an iron fist, employing tactics that shocked even their fellow chieftains in a time when violence was commonplace. They were known to hire mercenary clans to help them win battles against neighboring territories, only to turn on these same warriors after victory was achieved. Why pay for services, the O'Carrolls reasoned, when you can simply eliminate those you owe? The most infamous of these betrayals involved the McMahon clan. Charles O'Carroll had employed approximately 40 skilled McMahon warriors to train his men in new battle techniques. The training proved invaluable. with the MacMahon's help, the O'Carrolls won a significant victory against their enemies. To celebrate our victory and to thank you for your service, Charles O'Carroll announced to the MacMahon warriors, "I invite you all to a great feast here at Leapt Castle. We shall drink to our triumph and to your skill." The MacMahon warriors arrived expecting honor and payment for their services. The great hall was lit with torches, tables laden with food and drink. The celebration began with toasts and songs. But as the night wore on, the MacMahons began to feel strange. Their limbs grew heavy, their vision blurred. "Something's wrong," one warrior muttered to his companion, clutching at his stomach. The food, but it was too late. The food and drink served to them had been poisoned. As the celebration turned to agony and the MacMahons realized they had been betrayed, the halls of Leapt Castle echoed with their cries. All 40 warriors died that night, their bodies disposed of in ways that would not be discovered for centuries. But the most shocking act of violence in the O'Carroll era occurred within the family itself. And it happened in the chapel that gives us our clearest window into the brutality that defined this clan. Mulrooney O'Carroll, the chieftain of the clan, died in 1532 without clearly naming his successor. This was a catastrophic oversight in a family where power meant everything. 2 of his sons, both strong and ambitious, claimed the right to lead the clan. Their names were Thaddeus and Tage, and they could not have been more different. Thaddeus was a priest, a man of God who had taken holy orders. Despite his religious calling, he was still an O'Carroll, still ambitious, still convinced of his right to rule. As the older brother, tradition and his position in the church gave him a strong claim to leadership. He was known for his intelligence and his ability to navigate the complex politics of both church and clan. Tage, on the other hand, was a warrior through and through. He had lost one eye in battle, earning him the fearsome nickname One-Eyed Tage, or Tage. He was known for his fierce temper and his skill with a sword. In the days following their father's death, the tension between the brothers grew unbearable. They would pass each other in the castle corridors without speaking, each surrounded by their supporters. The clans split into factions, whispers spreading through the halls. Thaddeus is the eldest, some would say. He has the church's blessing. But what kind of leader is a priest? Others countered. We need a warrior, not a man of prayers. Thaddeus decided to assert his authority by holding a family mass in the castle's chapel. It was a strategic move, gathering the family in a holy space, with him presiding as both priest and would-be chieftain. The message was clear. God and tradition supported his claim. On that fateful day, the family gathered in the chapel, which occupied a room in the upper levels of the keep, above the main hall. It was a modest space, but sacred, with an altar and a window that looked out over the Irish countryside. As Thaddeus began the Mass, his family members knelt or stood watching, some uneasy with the growing tension. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti, Thaddeus intoned, beginning the ritual. His voice was steady, confident, as if already assured of his victory. Tage had not been present when the Mass began. Whether this was intentional or accidental, no one can say for certain. But when he arrived and found that his brother had started without him, a grave sign of disrespect in those times, his rage could no longer be contained. The heavy wooden door to the chapel burst open with a crash that made the gathered O'Carroll start. Tage O'Carroll strode in, still wearing his sword, his one good eye blazing with fury. He walked straight toward the altar where Thaddeus stood, his brothers back to him as he conducted the Mass. Thaddeus heard the footsteps, but did not turn, did not stop the Mass. Perhaps he thought his brother would not dare disturb a holy ceremony. Perhaps he believed the sanctity of the chapel would protect him. He was wrong. Without a word, without hesitation, Tage drew his sword. The blade sang as it left its scabbard. And then, in front of the entire assembled family, he plunged it deep into his brother's back. Thaddeus gasped, his words of prayer cut short. He fell forward across the altar, his blood spilling onto the sacred space, mixing with the communion wine, staining the white altar cloth crimson. He died there in front of his family, murdered during Mass, struck down by his own brother in the holiest moment of the Catholic ritual. The chapel fell silent, except for the sound of Thaddeus's blood dripping onto the stone floor. The family stood frozen in horror, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Tage withdrew his sword, his face showing neither remorse nor triumph, only a cold satisfaction that the matter was settled. "I am the O'Carroll now," he said quietly, and no one dared contradict him. From that day forward, the chapel would be known as the Bloody Chapel. It is said that no amount of cleaning could ever completely remove the stain of Thaddeus's blood from the stone floor. Even centuries later, visitors would report seeing dark stains on the floor that appeared and disappeared, as if the stone itself remembered what had happened there. But the horrors of the Bloody Chapel went deeper than even this fratricide. In the northeastern corner of the chapel, behind the altar where Thaddeus died, the O'Carrolls had constructed something truly sinister, a hidden chamber accessed only by a narrow trapdoor. This type of chamber is called an oubliette, from the French word oublier, meaning to forget. In some castles, oubliettes were used to store valuables or as hiding places during sieges. But the O'Carrolls had modified their oubliette for a much darker purpose. The chamber was small, perhaps 8 feet deep, with no windows and no door except for the trapdoor above. But what made this oubliette particularly horrific was what the O'Carrolls had placed at the bottom. A bed of sharp wooden spikes, pointing upward, waiting. When the O'Carrolls wanted to dispose of someone, a captured enemy, a betrayed mercenary, an unwanted guest, they would bring them to the Bloody Chapel under some pretense. The victim would be positioned over the hidden trapdoor, perhaps told to stand on a particular spot while some matter was discussed. And then, with no warning, the door would open beneath their feet. They would fall through the darkness, their lungs pierced by the spikes below. If the fall didn't kill them immediately, they would die slowly in the darkness, their cries for help unheard or deliberately ignored. And then, as the name suggests, they would be forgotten, left to rot in their hidden grave, while the O'Carrolls went about their business in the rooms above. For centuries, the oubliette remained sealed and secret, its terrible contents unknown to the later owners of the castle. The O'Carroll era eventually ended when the castle changed hands during the turbulent period of the Cromwellian conquest in the mid-1600s. Historical sources vary. Some say 1642, others 1649 or 1659. But the castle passed to Captain Jonathan Darby, an English soldier, either through marriage to an O'Carroll daughter or as payment for his military service. The Darbys made Leap Castle their home, renovating and expanding it, trying to turn this fortress of horrors into a proper country estate. They had no idea what lay hidden beneath their feet in the bloody chapel. It wasn't until the early 1900s, during renovation work, that workmen made a discovery that would shock even those familiar with Ireland's bloody history. While working in the bloody chapel, they found the hidden trapdoor. When they pried it open and peered down into the darkness below, they discovered a charnel house of unimaginable proportions. The oubliette was filled with human skeletons, piled upon each other in a grim heap of bones and skulls. The wooden spikes, though old and rotted, were still visible among the remains. "Holy Mother of God," one of the workers whispered, backing away from the opening. "There must be dozens of them down there." "More than dozens," another replied, his face pale. "We'll need carts to clear them all." It took 3 cartloads to remove all the skeletons, approximately 150 bodies in total, the victims of the O'Carrolls' cruelty. Among the bones, the workers found something else that sent chills through everyone involved: a pocket watch, dating from the mid-1800s. This meant the oubliette had been used not just in medieval times, but possibly up until just a few decades before its discovery. "The Darbys couldn't have known about this," one worker said. "Could they? Who's to say?" another replied darkly. "This is a house of secrets, always has been." Some of the workers refused to continue renovations after that, claiming they heard screams and moans coming from the empty oubliette. Others reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread whenever they entered the bloody chapel. It was as if opening the oubliette had released something, not just the physical remains of the victims, but their rage, their fear, their unquiet spirits. And they were right. Things were about to get much worse at Leap Castle. Chapter 3. The Darby Years and Mildred's Encounter. When 20-year-old Mildred Dill, known to her friends as Millie, married 35-year-old Jonathan Charles Darby on November 7th, 1889. She had no idea that she was about to take up residence in what would become known as the most haunted castle in all of Ireland. Millie was bright, educated, and full of literary ambition. She had attended Oxford and dreamed of a writing career, much to the frustration of her strict Plymouth Brethren parents. Before her engagement, she had even run away to join the Salvation Army with the intention of tending to London's poor. She was independent, compassionate, and utterly unsuited to the life of a conventional Victorian wife. Jonathan Charles Darby was, in many ways, her opposite. He was a strict, conservative man with a violent temper, an Orange Unionist who viewed the Catholic Irish with suspicion and disdain. Locals would later remember him for deliberately tracking mud from the stables onto his wife's freshly cleaned floors just to upset her. The floors, Jonathan, Millie would protest, exasperated. The servants just cleaned them. "This is my house," he would reply coldly. "I'll walk where I please." Despite this difficult marriage, Millie found an outlet in her writing. Under the pen name Andrew Mary, she began publishing short stories and novels that received favorable reviews from publications like The Spectator, which praised her work as worthy of comparison to the best Irish literature of the day. She wrote with particular insight about Irish life and the people around Leap Castle, showing an understanding and empathy that her husband decidedly lacked. But Millie had another interest, one that was fashionable among the educated classes of her era: the occult. In the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, seances, automatic writing, and spiritualism were popular pastimes. The boundary between entertainment and genuine belief was often blurred. People would gather in darkened parlors to attempt communication with the dead, fascinated by the possibility that consciousness might continue beyond death. Millie began hosting seances at Leap Castle. She would invite friends and neighbors to gather around tables in the dim lamplight, their hands joined, calling out to the spirits. "Is anyone there?" she would ask into the darkness. "If you can hear us, give us a sign." She practiced automatic writing, allowing her hand to move across the page, supposedly guided by spirits, producing strange messages and drawings. Her friends found it thrilling, a delightful diversion from the tedium of country life. Jonathan disapproved, of course. "Nonsense and foolishness," he would mutter. "The only spirits in this house are in the cellars." But Millie continued her experiments, unaware that she was about to awaken something far beyond her understanding. It was during this period that workmen made the terrible discovery in the Bloody Chapel. When they cleared out the oubliette and removed 3 cartloads of bones, Millie felt something change in the castle. Doors that had always opened smoothly now stuck. Cold spots appeared in rooms that should have been warm. She began to hear sounds. Noises like furniture being moved were frequently heard at night, she would later write. And strangers staying with us have often asked why the servants turned out the rooms underneath them at such an unusual hour. The front door bell sometimes rang, and I have gone down, but found no one. She mentioned these occurrences to her husband once, but his reaction was so dismissive and angry that she learned not to speak of them in his presence. Then came the evening that would change everything. Millie was standing in the gallery, a corridor that ran around two sides of the castle's main hall. The gallery was lit by lamps, and she could see down into the hall below, also illuminated by lamplight. She was alone, or so she thought, perhaps contemplating her writing, or simply enjoying a moment of quiet in her turbulent household. Suddenly, she felt two hands placed firmly on her shoulders. She turned sharply, expecting to see her husband or a servant. Instead, she found herself face to face with something that defied description. Something so terrible that even years later, when she wrote about it in the Occult Review, she struggled to find words adequate to convey the horror. Suddenly, two hands were laid on my shoulders, she wrote. I turned round sharply and saw, as clearly as I see you now, a gray thing standing a couple of feet from me, with its bent arms raised as if it were cursing me. It stood roughly human in shape, but slightly shorter than Millie herself, about the size of a sheep. It was gray, not the gray of stone or shadows, but an unclean, bluish gray, something of the color and appearance of common cotton wool. She said, I cannot describe in words how utterly awful the thing was, she continued in her account. Its very undefinableness rendering the horrible shadow more gruesome. Human in shape. I could just make out the shape of big black holes like great eyes and sharp features. But the whole figure, head, face, hands, and all was gray, unclean, bluish gray. Where its face should have been, Millie could make out dark holes like eyes, hollow and bottomless, seeming to stare at her with an intelligence that was malevolent and alien. The features appeared both human and inhuman, sharp and somehow wrong, as if someone had attempted to create a human form, but had gotten the details subtly, disturbingly incorrect. But oh, so sinister, repulsive and devilish, she wrote. But worst of all was the smell. A horrible, overpowering stench of decomposing flesh, the smell of death, of rot, of bodies left to decay. The horrible smell, 100 times intensified, came up into my face, giving me a deadly nausea, Millie recalled. It was the smell of a decomposing corpse. She stood frozen, unable to move, unable to scream, as this gray thing stood before her with its arms raised in that cursing gesture. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The hands lifted from her shoulders. The figure vanished. The smell dissipated. Millie nearly collapsed. She grabbed the gallery railing to steady herself, her heart pounding, her stomach churning with nausea. She looked around frantically, but she was alone, completely alone. When she could finally move, she made her way to her private sitting room and sat down at her desk with shaking hands. She picked up her pen and began to write, describing everything she had seen and felt while the memory was still fresh. She needed to document it, to make sense of it, to prove to herself that it had really happened. She confided in friends who were interested in the occult. They told her she had encountered what they called an elemental, a primitive spirit that had never been human, something that attached itself to a particular place. It was malevolent, they said, terrifying and unpredictable. And her seances, her automatic writing, her dabbling in the occult, she may have awakened it or provoked it. "You must stop the seances, Millie," one friend warned her. "You're playing with forces you don't understand." But before she could decide what to do, the elemental appeared again. It was November 25th, 1915. Jonathan was supposed to be out late that evening, and Millie was away driving that afternoon. Two of the servants, knowing the master and mistress would both be absent, had invited friends, 2 soldiers from the barracks in Burr, to visit the castle. It was a harmless flirtation, but when Jonathan came home early, the visitors had to be kept hidden in the lower regions of one of the wings to avoid his wrath. As evening fell, Jonathan and Millie went upstairs to dress for dinner. They were in their separate rooms when suddenly a loud yell of terror-stricken voices echoed from the hall below. Millie ran out of her room and found Jonathan already in the corridor. "What the devil?" he began. "It came from downstairs," Millie said, her heart already racing with a terrible suspicion. They rushed toward the gallery. Jonathan was ahead of Millie as she passed through the corridor. And there, leaning against the gallery rail with its hands resting on top of it, was the thing, the elemental. Millie smelled it immediately, that horrible, overwhelming stench of decomposition that had haunted her dreams since her first encounter. Jonathan pulled up sharply about 10 feet from the entity. He turned, and instead of showing fear or even acknowledgement of what was before them, he let fly a volley of abuse at his wife. "Dressing up things to try and make a fool of me," he shouted. "I won't have it, Mildred. The only spirits in this house are in the cellars, and I'll thank you to stop this foolishness." Millie stood frozen, staring at the gray thing leaning on the railing, looking down into the hall below. Could Jonathan not see it? Or was he so determined in his skepticism that he refused to acknowledge what was right in front of him? Below them in the hall, all 4 of the visitors, the 2 servants, and the 2 soldiers, had seen and smelled the elemental looking down at them from the gallery. They had let out a collective scream and fled to the servants' quarters, where all 4 were violently sick from the smell and the terror. A guest of the Darbys, who witnessed the event later, wrote a letter describing what she saw. "I saw your eyes fixed upon something above our heads, and the next minute, my own eyes were filled by the sight of a thing in the gallery looking down at us." There was plenty of light from the lamps in the hall, and the one above on the wall at the corner of the gallery, for every one of us to see quite plainly the gray-colored figure about the height of a small grown-up person looking down at us. I wish I thought I could ever forget the sight of that gray figure, with dark spots like holes in its head instead of eyes, standing with gray arms folded on the gallery railing looking down at us. Then, just as someone put foot on the gallery, the thing that he saw there, that we were watching, suddenly faded out of sight. The thing did not move, only became less and less visible until it vanished. The next morning, the two maids presented Millie with letters claiming it was necessary for them to immediately visit their homes. They never returned to Leapt Castle. The entity that Millie had encountered was unlike any human ghost. Where the spirits of the murdered priest and the betrayed mercenaries seemed to be trapped in their human trauma, the elemental was something else entirely. Something primitive, non-human, something that had never walked the earth as a living person. There were theories about what it might be. Some believed the elemental was placed there by druids long before the castle was ever built, set as a guardian to protect the sacred site used for druidic initiations and ceremonies. If this was true, then the elemental might be thousands of years old, bound to the land itself. Others suggested that the elemental was sent by Gerald Fitzgerald, the Earl of Kildare, a renowned practitioner of magic, who had tried unsuccessfully to seize Leapt Castle in 1513 and 1516. Perhaps Fitzgerald had cursed the castle with this entity, setting it to destroy the O'Carrolls from within. A third explanation, offered by local legends, was that the elemental was the spirit of an ancient O'Carroll who died of leprosy within the castle walls. This would explain the decomposing appearance and the horrible smell of rotting flesh that accompanied its appearances. But the elemental was not the only spirit haunting the castle. Millie documented at least 19 different entities that she and others had encountered over the years. There was the Red Lady, a tall, lean woman in a long red dress with long brown hair. She was often seen in what had once been the nursery, now called the Blue Room, though she appeared throughout the castle. She always carried a dagger, raised as if ready to strike. Once, Millie had seen her in the Blue Room, and the woman appeared to be crying, her ghostly form shaking with silent sobs. The story behind the Red Lady was particularly tragic. She was said to have been captured by an O'Carroll and held prisoner in the castle. When her captors took her infant child from her and killed it, she took her own life with the dagger. Now she wandered the castle, still searching for her stolen baby, ready to strike at anyone who might threaten a child. In the main hall, the ghosts of two little girls had been seen and heard playing. Emily, between 11 and 12 years old, had fallen from the top of the castle to the grounds below. Her playmate, Charlotte, between 6 and 7 years old, had died from an infectious disease. Their laughter sometimes echoed through the halls, a strange contrast to the darker spirits that haunted this place. Visitors would see them playing, running up and down the stairs, their childish joy somehow surviving death itself. The murdered priest, Thaddeus O'Carroll, continued to haunt the bloody chapel and the stairway below it. People would see him standing near the altar where he died, his translucent form dressed in priestly robes, his face sorrowful. Even when the castle stood empty and in ruins, passers-by would see lights glowing from the chapel window, as if Mass were being celebrated by the long-dead priest. In the priest's house, a separate wing of the castle, Millie documented numerous other spirits. There was something heavy that would lie on people's beds and snore, making the sleeper feel the weight of a great body pressing against them. A monk with a tonsure and cowl would walk in at one window and out another. A burly man in rough peasant clothes would push a heavy barrel up the back stairs near the servants' bedrooms, and when he reached the top, the barrel would roll down and everything would disappear. Through all of this, Millie continued to write. She published a story called The House of Horrors in 1898 in Belgravia, a London magazine, thinly disguising Leap Castle as Kilman Castle and changing the names, but making it clear to those who knew the place that she was writing about her experiences. When Jonathan discovered the story, he was furious. "How dare you?" he shouted, brandishing the magazine. "I forbade you to speak of this nonsense, and you publish it for the world to read." "It's fiction, Jonathan," Millie replied, though her voice trembled. "Just a story. It's my house, my family's castle. And you make us look like fools with your ghost stories and seances." He never forgave her. Their marriage, already strained, became even more bitter. Millie found solace in her writing and in the company of visitors who were fascinated by the castle's history. Among these was young Rex Ingram, whose brother Alfred would later become the famous film director. Rex was captivated by the ghost stories, and Millie would sit with him for hours, telling him tales of the castle's haunted history. But by the early 1920s, larger forces were moving through Ireland. The country was in the midst of a civil war between those who supported the treaty with Britain and those who wanted complete independence. The Darby family, as English Protestant landlords, found themselves increasingly at odds with their Irish Catholic tenants. Jonathan had raised the rents to pay for his renovations and sold off much of the surrounding land. The tenants, many of whom had farmed this land for generations, were resentful and angry. They refused to pay rent and boycotted the Darbys. The situation escalated quickly. There were shots fired through the windows, Millie would later write to a friend. Our garden was destroyed. We didn't feel safe anymore. In April or May of 1922, the Darbys fled Leap Castle, taking refuge with their daughter in Longford. We were forced to leave with only a few clothes, Millie wrote, leaving all our precious belongings behind us. Jonathan had managed to move his books and some valuables to a safe house nearby, having received word that the castle might be burned. But Millie's possessions remained in the castle: her clothes, her jewelry, and most devastatingly, all her writings. Over 150 short stories and 2 complete novels, representing over 30 years of work, were still in her desk and filing cabinets. On the morning of Sunday, July 30th, 1922, an unidentified group of 11 men broke into the empty castle. They smashed the furniture into kindling and set the castle ablaze. The fire destroyed the center and northern portions of Leapt Castle, leaving only the medieval keep and some of the outer walls standing. The castle that had survived 800 years of warfare, betrayal, and bloodshed was gutted by flames in a single night. And with it burned Millie's life's work, her stories, her novels, her documentation of the haunting, all turned to ash. In the compensation claim hearings that followed, Millie stood before officials and testified about her losses. Her voice was steady, but those who knew her could see the devastation in her eyes. She had lost more than just possessions. She had lost 30 years of her creative life, stories that would never be recovered, characters and plots that had vanished with the flames. The castle that had been so full of ghostly voices was now silent, a burned-out ruin standing sentinel over the Irish countryside. But the spirits remained. Even in ruins, Leap Castle was not empty. Chapter 4: The Spirits That Walk. After the fire of 1922, Leap Castle stood as a blackened skeleton against the Irish sky. The roof was gone, exposing the interior to wind and rain. The floors had collapsed into the cellars below. The beautiful Victorian extensions that the Darbys had added were reduced to charred shells. Only the medieval keep, the original tower built by the O'Bannons 700 years before, remained relatively intact. Its thick stone walls, having survived yet another catastrophe. For decades, the ruin became a local landmark, a place of dark fascination. Children would dare each other to approach it after dark, though few had the courage to actually enter the grounds. Go on, one boy would challenge another. Touch the gate at least. Not for all the money in Ireland, the other would reply, eyeing the dark silhouette nervously. You know what they say about that place, and what they said was true. Even in ruins, Leap Castle was not empty. Locals told stories about the castle's haunted history, tales that grew in the telling. More than one passerby reported seeing strange lights in the windows of the keep, or hearing sounds that had no earthly source. A woman walking her dog near the castle grounds one evening in the 1950s later swore she heard children laughing from inside the ruins, though she knew no children lived anywhere near the place. It was the sweetest sound, she told her neighbors later, like little girls playing. But when I looked, there was nothing there but empty stone and shadows. The ghost of Thaddeus O'Carroll, the murdered priest, continued to appear in the bloody chapel. Even with no roof overhead and the floor open to the elements, people reported seeing his translucent figure standing where the altar had once been. Some claimed to see him on the spiral staircase that led up to the chapel, ascending or descending the worn stone steps, as if still preparing to say Mass, still unaware that centuries had passed since his brother's blade found his back. The elemental remained as well, though fewer people dared to venture close enough to encounter it. Those who did sometimes caught that horrible smell of decomposition on the wind, or glimpsed something gray and wrong moving through the ruined corridors. In 1974, a man named Peter Bartlett purchased the ruined castle. He was an Australian with Irish roots and a dream of restoring this historic building. When friends asked him why he would want to take on such a daunting project, especially one with such a dark reputation, he would smile. Because it deserves a second chance, he would say. Every building has a story. This one just happens to have more stories than most. Peter worked tirelessly for 15 years, slowly bringing the castle back from the brink of total collapse. He rebuilt walls, restored floors, made the structure sound again. He respected the history of the place, keeping as much of the original medieval architecture as possible, while making the castle livable once more. But restoration work was slow and expensive, and by 1989, Peter had done all he could. The castle needed someone with the dedication and resources to continue the work. That someone arrived in 1991 in the form of Sean Ryan and his wife Anne. Sean Ryan was a musician and composer, a man with a deep appreciation for Irish history and heritage. When he first saw Leap Castle, even in its partially restored but still ruined state, he felt an immediate connection to the place. "I felt like it was calling to me," Sean would later say. "I know that sounds strange, but there was something about it. Despite its history, despite everything that had happened here, I felt welcome." Anne was more skeptical at first. She knew the castle's reputation, had heard the stories about the ghosts and the elemental. But Sean was convinced this was where they were meant to be. "We can restore it," he told her, walking through the echoing halls. "We can bring it back to life. And maybe, just maybe, we can bring some peace to this place." They purchased the castle and moved in, beginning what would become a decades-long labor of love. Sean and Anne approached the restoration with reverence and respect, not just for the building, but for the spirits that dwelt within it. "You have to understand," Sean explained to a visitor years later, "this isn't just a building. It's home to many presences, many energies. We're not the only ones living here. We've just learned to live together." From the beginning, Sean and Anne experienced the paranormal activity that had driven others away. Doors would open and close on their own. Footsteps echoed through empty corridors. Objects would move from where they had been left. But unlike previous inhabitants who had been frightened or skeptical, Sean and Anne accepted these occurrences as part of living in Leap Castle. "Good morning," Sean would call out cheerfully when he heard footsteps on the stairs and found no one there. "Just me, heading down to make some tea." Anne took a similar approach. When she found items moved in the kitchen, she would simply put them back and say, "Please leave the dishes where I put them. It makes cooking much easier." The spirits seemed to respond to this respectful acknowledgement. The activity continued, but it rarely felt threatening or malicious. One evening, as Sean was working late in his music studio, located in what had once been part of the priest's house, he felt a presence in the room with him. He looked up from his sheet music and saw, standing near the window, the translucent figure of a monk in a brown robe with a tonsured head. "Evening," Sean said calmly, his heart racing but his voice steady. "Don't mind me, just working on a new piece." The monk appeared to watch him for a moment, then walked slowly across the room and passed through the opposite wall. Sean sat for a moment, breathing deeply, then picked up his pen and continued his work. "That was interesting," he said to Anne later that night. "Met one of our neighbors this evening. The monk that Mildred Darby wrote about." "What did you do?" Anne asked. "Said hello. What else could I do? He lives here too." But not all the encounters were so benign. The elemental still made its presence known, particularly in the area near the bloody chapel and the oubliette. Sean was working on restoration in the chapel one afternoon when he suddenly smelled it, that horrible, overwhelming stench of rotting flesh that Mildred Darby had described so vividly. The smell was so powerful that Sean had to leave the room, his stomach churning with nausea. "I've smelled death before," he told Anne later. "This was worse, much worse. It was like concentrated decay. And there was a feeling with it, a presence that was definitely not friendly." They consulted with paranormal investigators and historians who confirmed what they had suspected. The elemental was still very much resident at Leapt Castle. Unlike the other ghosts, who seemed to be replaying moments from their lives or seeking something they had lost, the elemental was aware, intelligent, and unpredictable. "We give it space," Sean explained. "We don't go into certain areas unless we absolutely have to. And we never, ever attempt to provoke it or communicate with it. That's not something you want to invite into conversation." The Ryans' respectful approach to the spirits seemed to work. As the years passed and the restoration progressed, the atmosphere in the castle began to change. It was still haunted, there was no question about that. But the sense of oppressive darkness began to lift, replaced by something more complex and nuanced. Visitors to Leap Castle during this period reported different experiences, depending on where they were in the building and their sensitivity to the paranormal. Some felt nothing unusual at all, simply enjoying the medieval architecture and the beautiful Irish countryside visible from the windows. Others had profound experiences. A paranormal investigator who visited in the early 2000s described standing in the bloody chapel and feeling an overwhelming sense of sorrow. "It wasn't frightening," she said. "It was just deeply, profoundly sad. Like the room itself was grieving for what had happened there." In the main hall, people continued to hear the laughter of the two little girls, Emily and Charlotte. Their spirits seemed to be among the most active in the castle and the most benign. "We actually quite like having them around," Anne said. "It's comforting in a strange way. Children's laughter in an old castle, it reminds you that this place wasn't always about death and darkness. Families lived here. Children played here. There was joy here too." Sean and Anne's approach to living with the spirits included one particularly significant gesture. They decided to hold a christening in the bloody chapel. "It was time to bring light back into that space," Sean explained. "For too long, the chapel has been defined by violence and death. We wanted to reconsecrate it in a way, to bring new life, innocence, and hope into a room that has seen so much darkness." They held the ceremony with close friends and family, a priest presiding over the baptism of a friend's child. Anne decorated the chapel with flowers. Sean played music. The gathering was small but meaningful. "I could feel something shift that day," Anne said later. "Like the room took a breath it had been holding for centuries. The weight lifted just a little. Thaddeus's spirit is still there. I've seen him on the stairs since then, but he seems calmer somehow, less tormented." Word of Leap Castle's haunting had spread far beyond Ireland by this time. In the 2000s and 2010s, several paranormal investigation television shows requested permission to film at the castle. Ghost Hunters, Most Haunted, Ghost Adventures, and Paranormal Lockdown all featured episodes filmed at Leap. Sean and Anne were careful about which requests they accepted. They didn't want the castle turned into a circus or the spirits treated with disrespect. "These aren't special effects or entertainment," Sean told one producer firmly. "These are real presences, real energies. If you come here, you come with respect, or you don't come at all." The investigations that were conducted captured some remarkable phenomena. Electronic voice phenomena, EVP recordings, picked up what sounded like voices speaking in Old Irish Gaelic. Cameras caught unexplained shadows and light anomalies. Investigators reported being touched, pushed, or feeling sudden temperature drops. During the Ghost Adventures investigation, host Zach Baggins had a particularly intense experience in the bloody chapel. He reported feeling an overwhelming sense of anger and hostility, and claimed to have been pushed by an unseen force. The experience left him visibly shaken. "There's something very wrong in that room," he said afterward. "Whatever is there, it doesn't want us here." But perhaps the most compelling evidence came from the personal testimonies of visitors who had no connection to paranormal investigation and no expectation of encountering anything unusual. A historian who visited to study the castle's medieval architecture found himself in conversation with what he thought was a tour guide dressed in period clothing. Only later did he realize that Sean and Anne had been the only other people in the castle that day, and they had been in a completely different wing. He told me about the building of the keep, the historian said. Details about the construction methods that I later verified in historical documents. But when I turned to thank him, he was gone. And when I described him to Sean, he just smiled and said, "Ah, you met one of the O'Bannons." A young woman visiting with her family reported seeing the Red Lady in the blue room. She hadn't been told about the ghost before her visit and had no knowledge of the castle's history. There was a woman standing by the window, she told Anne afterward, her face pale. She was wearing a long red dress and she was crying. She had something in her hand, a knife, I think. I asked if she was okay, and she just looked at me with the saddest eyes I've ever seen. Then she wasn't there anymore. She just wasn't there. Anne nodded. That's her, the Red Lady. She's looking for her baby. She's been looking for hundreds of years. That's so sad, the young woman whispered. Can't someone help her? We try, Anne said gently. We acknowledge her. We don't fear her. Maybe that's the best we can do. Let her know she's not forgotten. As Leap Castle gained international attention for its haunting, it also gained recognition for what Sean and Anne had accomplished. They had taken a ruin, a burned-out shell of violence and darkness, and transformed it into a home. They had brought life back to a place of death. And perhaps most importantly, they had shown that it was possible to coexist with the past, to acknowledge the darkness without being consumed by it. Sean began offering private tour to small groups, sharing the castle's history and his own experiences. He was honest about the haunting, neither exaggerating for effect nor downplaying the very real phenomena that occurred. People ask me if I'm afraid to live here, he would tell tour groups. The answer is no. Fear comes from not understanding, from seeing these spirits as threats. But they're not threats. They're souls who are stuck, or memories that are so strong they've imprinted on this place. My job is to be a good neighbor, to respect their space, and to tell their stories so they're not forgotten. He would pause at the entrance to the bloody chapel, his voice becoming more serious. This room has seen terrible things. A brother murdered his brother here during Mass. Below this floor, there's an oubliette where at least 150 people died horrible deaths. That darkness is real. It happened. But acknowledging darkness doesn't mean we have to let it define us or this place. We can honor the dead, remember what happened, and still choose to bring light into the shadows. Visitors who came expecting sensationalism and horror often left with something more profound, a sense of the complexity of history, the persistence of memory, and the possibility of redemption, even in the darkest places. Leap Castle's reputation as the most haunted castle in Ireland, and possibly the world, was well earned. But under Sean and Anne Ryan's stewardship, it had become something more than just a house of horrors. It had become a testament to the human capacity to face darkness and choose light, to acknowledge the past while building toward a better future. And the spirits, they remained. Thaddeus still walked the stairs to his chapel. The Red Lady still searched for her lost child. Emily and Charlotte still played in the hall. The elemental still lurked in the shadows, ancient and unknowable. And in the oubliette, if you stood very still and listened carefully, you might still hear the faint echoes of those who fell into darkness and never climbed out. But perhaps, just perhaps, these spirits were a little less lonely now. Someone was finally listening to their stories. Someone finally acknowledged their presence without fear or exploitation. And in a castle built on blood and betrayal, that simple act of recognition might be the closest thing to peace that any of them would ever find. Chapter 5: Restoration and Reconciliation. As the years turned into decades, Sean and Anne Ryan's work at Leap Castle continued with patience and dedication. The restoration was never rushed. Every stone that was replaced, every beam that was reinforced, was done with careful consideration for the castle's long history and the many presences that called it home. We're not trying to erase what happened here, Sean explained to a journalist who visited in 2015. We're trying to honor it. This castle has survived nearly 800 years because it's strong. Our job is to keep it strong for the next 800. The castle began to take on a new life under their care. The medieval keep stood proud once again, its walls restored and weatherproofed. The bloody chapel, while still holding its dark history, had been carefully preserved. The oubliette remained visible, but secured, a reminder of the horrors of the past that should never be forgotten. Sean had installed a music studio in one of the restored wings, and often he would compose there late into the night. Sometimes, he said, he felt he had an audience. "I'll be playing something, working out a new melody," he told a friend, "and I'll get this feeling that someone is listening, not in a threatening way, more like they're curious. Music is older than this castle. Maybe it's something that connects us all, the living and the dead." Anne had created a beautiful garden on the grounds, planting flowers and herbs that would have been familiar to the castle's medieval inhabitants. She found it therapeutic, she said, to put life back into soil that had known so much death. Every spring when the flowers bloom, she said, it's like the castle is reminding us that renewal is always possible. No matter how dark the winter, spring always comes. Their approach to the haunting remained consistent over the years, respectful acknowledgement without fear. They never attempted to cleanse the castle or drive out the spirits. They simply lived their lives and let the ghosts live theirs. "We're all residents here," Sean would say. "We just exist in different states. They have as much right to be here as we do more, really. They were here first. The relationship between the living and the dead at Leap Castle seemed to reach a kind of equilibrium. The paranormal activity continued, but it became part of the rhythm of daily life. Anne would sometimes find kitchen utensils rearranged and simply rearrange them back. Sean would hear footsteps in empty rooms and think nothing of it. They had learned to distinguish between the different presences in the castle. Thaddeus is the easiest to sense, Anne explained. There's a sadness to him, but not malevolence. He's just stuck, I think, replaying that terrible moment over and over. The little girls are lovely, Sean added with a smile. Sometimes when we have friends visiting with children, the living kids will say they've been playing with two girls they met in the hall. They describe Emily and Charlotte perfectly, but they don't realize there's anything unusual about them. And the elemental, a visitor once asked. Sean's expression became more serious. The elemental is different. It's not human, never was. It's something older, something that doesn't follow the rules that the other spirits seem to follow. We respect its space, and most of the time, it respects ours. But there are days when you can feel it watching, waiting. Those are the days we're extra careful, despite the active haunting, or perhaps because of it. Leap Castle, under the Ryans' care, became a place of pilgrimage for people interested in history, architecture, and the paranormal. Sean offered private tour by appointment, keeping the groups small and the experience intimate. He would lead visitors through the restored rooms, telling the stories of those who had lived and died within these walls. In the bloody chapel, he would point out the spot where the altar once stood, where Thaddeus O'Carroll fell when his brother's sword found its mark. Stand here for a moment, he would say to visitors. Close your eyes, just feel the room. What do you sense? Many people reported feeling a heaviness in the chapel, a sense of profound sadness. Some felt cold spots. A few sensitive individuals claimed to see shadows moving where no shadows should be. In the hall where the oubliette had been discovered, Sean would describe the excavation, the 3 cartloads of bones, the horrible realization of what the O'Carrolls had done. 150 people, he would say quietly. 150 souls who died in terror and darkness, who were meant to be forgotten. But we remember them. Their deaths were not meaningless. They matter. They are part of this castle's story. He would sometimes place candles near the sealed oubliette, a small gesture of remembrance for those nameless victims. As Leap Castle's fame grew, Sean and Anne found themselves becoming unexpected ambassadors for a different way of thinking about haunted places. They appeared in documentaries and gave interviews, always emphasizing the same themes: respect for history, acknowledgement of the past, and coexistence rather than confrontation. People want to know how we can live in the most haunted castle in Ireland, Anne said during one interview. They expect us to be terrified or to talk about constant battles with evil spirits. But that's not our experience. Yes, there are presences here. Yes, unexplained things happen. But we chose to approach them with compassion rather than fear, and that has made all the difference. One of the most moving moments in the castle's modern history came during a visit from a descendant of the O'Carroll clan. The elderly man had traveled from America specifically to see the castle where his ancestors had lived and died. Sean gave him a private tour, sharing the history honestly, including the brutal acts committed by the O'Carrolls. The man listened with tears in his eyes. "I can't change what they did," he said when they reached the bloody chapel. "I can't undo the violence or bring back the dead, but I can acknowledge it. I can say that it was wrong, that they were wrong." "Does that mean anything?" "It means everything," Sean replied. "Acknowledgement is the first step toward healing. Your ancestors caused great suffering here, but they also suffered themselves. The cycle of violence consumed them too. By acknowledging that, by refusing to defend or excuse it, you're breaking the cycle." The man stood in the chapel for a long time in silence. Then he knelt and said a prayer for his ancestors, for their victims, for all the souls trapped by violence and tragedy. When he stood, both he and Sean felt something shift in the room. The oppressive heaviness seemed to lift, just slightly. It was as if the chapel itself had been waiting for that moment of recognition, that simple act of honest reckoning with the past. "Did you feel that?" the man whispered. Sean nodded. "I think Thaddeus has been waiting a long time for someone from his family to acknowledge what happened to him. Maybe for someone to forgive." As the sun began to set that evening, painting the Irish countryside in gold and amber, Sean stood at one of the castle windows and watched the light fade. Behind him, he heard the familiar sound of small footsteps, Emily and Charlotte, playing their eternal game. "Good night, girls," he said softly. The footsteps paused, then continued. He smiled. Even ghost children needed their playtime. Anne joined him at the window, slipping her hand into his. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Buying this place, taking on all of this?" Sean thought for a moment. "Not once," he finally said. This castle needed someone to believe it could be more than just its darkest moments. These spirits needed someone to acknowledge them without fear. And maybe we needed this place too. Where else could we learn so much about resilience, about the persistence of memory, about the importance of facing darkness without being consumed by it? They stood together as night fell over Leapt Castle. Inside the ancient walls, the spirits continued their routines, Thaddeus on his stairs, the Red Lady searching the rooms, the monk walking his eternal path. And in the shadows near the bloody chapel, the elemental watched and waited, ancient and unknowable. But there was life here too. Music from Sean's studio would soon float through the corridors. The scent of Anne's cooking would fill the kitchen. Friends would visit, drawn by the Ryan's warmth and the castle's fascinating history. Children would laugh in the hall, playing with companions they couldn't quite see, but somehow knew were friendly. Leap Castle had been built on violence and christened in blood. It had witnessed betrayal, murder, cruelty beyond imagination. It had burned and fallen into ruin. It had been abandoned and forgotten, but it had survived. And now, under the careful stewardship of two people who understood that the past cannot be erased, but can be honored, It had become something remarkable, a place where history lived and breathed, where the boundary between past and present was thin enough to touch, where the dead and the living shared the same space in unexpected harmony. The stories of Leap Castle are not over. The spirits remain. The darkness that soaked into these stones over 8 centuries has not disappeared. The elemental still lurks in the shadows, a reminder that some mysteries are beyond human understanding. The victims of the oubliette still cry out in the silence, demanding that their deaths be remembered. But there is light here now too. There is music and laughter. There are flowers in the garden and candles in the windows. There are people who care for this place, who tell its stories honestly, who refuse to let the darkness have the final word. As you drift towards sleep, imagine standing on the grounds of Leap Castle on a quiet Irish evening. The wind whispers through the ancient stones. The last light of day fades behind the sleeve bloom mountains. And from somewhere inside those weathered walls, you hear it, a sound that might be the wind, or might be whispered prayers, or might be the echo of all the souls who have passed through this place over 800 years. They are not gone. They are not forgotten. They are part of the story that continues, night after night, in Ireland's most haunted castle, and perhaps in being remembered, in having their stories told and their presence acknowledged. They have found something close to peace. Not an ending, but a continuation. Not silence, but a voice. Not emptiness, but eternal presence. Rest now. The castle stands watch through the night, as it has for nearly 800 years. The spirits walk their ancient paths. The stones remember everything. And tomorrow, when the sun rises over County Offaly, Leap Castle will still be there, haunted, historic, and home to both the living and the dead. This is the story of Leap Castle, the most haunted castle in Ireland. May all its souls, living and dead, find the peace they seek. The end. Author's note. This story is based on historical facts and documented accounts of the haunting at Leap Castle. The major events, the building of the castle, the murder of Thaddeus O'Carroll, the discovery of the oubliette, Mildred Darby's encounters with the elemental, the burning of the castle, and Sean and Anne Ryan's restoration, are all factually accurate based on historical records, Mildred Darby's published writings, and interviews with current owner Sean Ryan, while some dialogue and specific scenes have been dramatized for narrative flow. The core facts and timeline of events remain true to the castle's documented history.